So here we are, close to Pesach. And Pesach, Passover, celebrates the experience of God's taking the Israelites out of Egypt with many miracles. It's also the beginning of our calendar that begins with Nisan, which is when at the very beginning, God gave us, the beginning of this Egypt process, God gave us the commandment to count the calendar from Nisan so that we could make an appointment with God, so that we could on the 10th take the lamb, on the 14th get ready for the Passover sacrifice and be ready to go. So this is the beginning of the process of our counting of the months, which is the Jewish year. But as we're going to see, that the exodus of Egypt is an experience of the present as well as the past. Now, a Jewish holiday is a time when we have to personally experience and relive what's going on. In other words, we're not just saying this happened once upon a time, but it's like the calendar is like a spiral. And so we go under that space again, where God took the Jewish people out of Egypt. And so we are meant to be personally going out of Egypt at that time of the Seder. So it's something that we live. And we're going to talk about what that actually means. So every Jewish holiday has a contemporary message for every Jew in every time and place. And this is particularly true of Pesach. So our sages tell us to mention Pesach in our daily prayers, in our Shabbat Kiddush, and we continue to remember Pesach is ongoing. And we're going to find out what that actually means. Now, on the Seder itself, on Pesach Eve, on the eve of Passover, the purpose is to give every individual an opportunity to experience an exodus from his own personal house of bondage. So people have their own house of bondage. It's not just once upon a time, there were the Egyptians and then we got out and it's over. We have to understand that this is an ongoing process. The opening of the Seder expresses this concept by telling us that we're going to recite the story of the Exodus. And the Seder is intended to move us to the point where we ourselves experience a liberation from slavery and view the matzah that it's in front of us as what it says in the Haggadah, the bread of affliction that our forefathers ate in the land of Egypt. Now, in every generation, it says, in every generation, a person is obligated to regard himself as if he personally left Egypt. So even without having been in Egypt or experienced actual slavery, redemption can be real for us. So Egypt is not only a geographical location, but it's also a state of mind, of feeling enslaved by what's around us or inside of us. So the Hebrew name for Egypt, Mitzrayim, is almost identical to the word Metzarim, which means straits or limitations. In other words, our personal exodus from Egypt involves self-transcendence, lifting ourselves out of our natural limitations. So in other words, sometimes we feel stuck in nature, and there's more than our own nature. We each have a soul, a spark of God. And like God himself, this spark is infinite and unbounded. Within ourselves, we have this infinite, unbounded spark that is connected into God. Now, on the personal level, Egypt symbolizes those influences and forces which confine and limit this spiritual potential. So whatever is confining the soul from being expressed is a kind of an Egypt. So the nature of this personal Egypt varies according to the person's character and degree of refinement. One person's Egypt could be his selfish desires and natural drives, the addictions that people have, the desires for approval, all kinds of things that create, they're coming from the ego, and people feel imprisoned over that. So another person's Egypt could be being stuck in the intellect and reason, that he can't get beyond reason, that he's going to come to a point where he's going to say, this doesn't make any sense. And there's even an Egypt of holiness, in which a person who, even though he's committed to spiritual growth, he holds back his potential for advancement because he accepts his natural limitations as permanent. That is so interesting, that when people feel that the places where we could get stuck, and everybody is dealing with this. This is not something that is such a thing could happen to somebody. We're all in the process of getting out of Egypt, which means getting to the place where our neshama is really shining and showing itself in our lives. And when we say, well, I've been working on this for so long, I'm still working on the same thing that I've been working on for so long. When a person says, what could you do? I guess that's who I am. That kind of giving up is in Egypt. But when a person says, I'm going forward with this, I'm going to start again with this, then I'm not finished. Okay, so I'm still working on the same thing I worked on before, but that doesn't mean that I can't, and that doesn't mean that I won't, and I will, and I can, and I am in process. So this is the struggle, because otherwise all of these Egypts confine our infinite godly nature. So leaving Egypt means, now the word Pesach means leaping over, but leaving Egypt means leaping over all these and any other barriers and constraints, and bringing our infinite spiritual potential to the surface. So interesting. Our infinite spiritual potential is not supposed to be something that we read about in the books. Oh, I have a godly soul. That's wonderful. It's in there someplace, I guess. What's supposed to happen is that our infinite spiritual potential comes into who we are, that we live with this infinite spiritual potential. So a personal experience of redemption affects the totality of our divine service. As long as a person lives within his personal Egypt, as long as the infinite potential of his soul is not able to be expressed, he will perceive the observance of the Torah and the mitzvahs as external to himself, separate from the essence of his being. So when he feels that way, he feels separate from what he does. He feels there's me and there's what I'm doing. Instead of feeling full of godliness, going into the mitzvah, of really living the mitzvah, of really doing the mitzvah, he feels a separation. When a person relives the Exodus and uncovers his essential godly nature, he develops a deeper connection with the Torah. This is one of the reasons why it's good when we're doing a mitzvah to slow down, be in the present, and do the mitzvah with focus. And then we put our soul, we're putting soul into what we're doing. Do it with soul. Experiencing a personal exodus from Egypt is the great foundation and strong pillar of our Torah and our faith. So this goes way beyond the time of the Pesach celebration, and it applies to every moment of our lives. So when the Exodus is understood this way, that it's not just something that happened then and it's over, but that it's an ongoing process, then every dimension of Jewish conduct and every mitzvah that a person does is taking a step out of Egypt and living an expression of his inner godly potential, an opportunity to realize his true self. So that's what we're supposed to be doing, that in everything we do and every mitzvah the person does, that we're taking this step out of Egypt and expressing who we really are, our godly potential. To emphasize that the exodus from Egypt is an ongoing experience, the Alter Rebbe did not put in his Haggadah what some other Jews do. At the end of the Haggadah, some Jews say the Pesach Seder has been concluded, but that's not in the Alter Rebbe's Haggadah, because Pesach is the beginning of the redemption process. It's not over. It's interesting that when I was a child, I thought that that's it, Pesach, that's it. And even when I got somewhat older, I thought, did I do it? Am I free? Did it happen? Is it done? You know, my Seder, I did it. But it took quite a while for me to understand that the Seder is the beginning of a process, and that in the process that we are working on being free. So simple things like ordering matzah and cleaning away the chametz, getting ready to have the flat bread that's matzah, to go beyond our own egos, to say, God, I'm here for you. I'm ready to go with you, whatever it is that you want. And you are taking me out to freedom. So we need to understand that even though we only eat matzah, if we're in Israel for the 7 days of Pesach, if we are Israeli, however that works, going to ask your Rav, or in outside of Israel, 8 days. When we're keeping those 8 days of eating matzah, even though we stop eating matzah after Pesach, it's not over at all. The transition from exile to redemption is a gradual, cumulative process, starting from the beginning of the exile. Not even from the end of the exile, but from the beginning of the exile. So similarly, the sages are teaching us to remember the redemption of Egypt every day in our prayers, both morning and evening. So the continued significance of the exodus from Egypt can be seen from another perspective. The Torah says of the Jewish people, they are my servants, who I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. The redemption from Egypt and the subsequent experience of receiving the Torah established the identity of the Jewish people as servants of God and not servants of servants. Everybody is serving something. Could ask people, who have jobs, what are you working for? And they come up with a conclusion of what they're doing. But we are servants of God. We're not servants of servants. So that means that our question is, what would you like me to do? How can I go forward in the way that you would like me to go forward? What is my godly service at this time? Until we see everything as godly service. Obviously, this is a process. After leaving Egypt, they could never again be subject to the same kind of servitude. And the Maharal of Prague explains that the freedom achieved through the Exodus transformed the essential nature of our people. Through the Exodus, we acquired the nature of free people. So even though we are still in exile, our nature has not changed. So we need to understand that. We're still in exile. God took us out of Egypt, and we, ever since then, have the nature of free people. And as we'll speak more, what's the process? But we need to know that until Mashiach comes and we have the Beit HaMikdash, which was God's intention, which has to do with revealing godliness in the world, we're still in exile. But we're still free. because God made us free. So our freedom is maintained only because, in a spiritual sense, God is constantly taking us out of Egypt. In the morning, we say the bracha somech noflim, that God is supporting the fallen. So what does it mean? There's always, gravity pulls people down. How can we get beyond that gravity? How can we experience true freedom? So we need to know that this miracle of the redemption is not just an event of the past, but is a constant occurrence in our daily lives. That this is what Hashem is doing, is taking us out of Egypt. But as with the first Egypt, we have to get up and be willing to go out with God. So we have to always be working on being free. This ongoing experience of redemption that's realized throughout our lives is intensified by reliving the Exodus during the Pesach holiday. The connection between the first and the last redemption, the first redemption being Egypt, the last redemption being with Mashiach, is referred to in the verse as, in the days when you left Egypt, I shall show you wonders during the final redemption. So just like God took us out of Egypt with miracles, miracles are happening now, and there will be greater miracles, even greater than miracles, wonders, where it's going to be like, wow, look what God is doing. Our rabbis ask, why does the verse, as in the days when you left Egypt, when Exodus took place on one day, as the verse states, remember this day on which you left Egypt? So in other words, there was one day, that's the day of the Pesach Seder, that God took us out of Egypt. And yet it says, remember the days. On the day the Jewish slaves left Egypt, they achieved the status of free people. But the transition is an ongoing experience that requires constant meditation on the concepts of slavery and freedom. And a person's thoughts have to have an effect on our daily conduct. So when we see people they are slaves to certain things. Well, a very common one is the telephone. The phone, people are slaves to the phone very often. Oh, let me just look in case what? In case what? How about not looking? Or food, or wasting time, or many other things that really people feel stuck in those things. And we have to think, we are the children of God. What does God want us to be? So how are we behaving? So that's why this spiritual redemption from all kinds of limitations that are the spiritual Egyptian exile, the physical and the spiritual Egyptian exile, is an ongoing process, even though the Jews' physical exodus took only one day. So when we see the exodus from Egypt as a continuing, ongoing process, that will lead to daily improvement in our own behavior, because we want to be a free person. So how am I going to do this? I don't want to do this the way I did it yesterday. I don't want to be a slave to the phone or whatever it is that I took too much time on it, so I didn't have the time I wanted for something else. Instead, I have to think I'm a free person. I can choose how to use my time or whatever it is that I need to do. So this is something that we have to think about. And we have to say, instead of saying, what could I do? I'm a slave to this and that. We're not slaves. God took us out of Egypt. We are no longer slaves. So you have to think about it and ask, in what way am I enslaved that I need to just get up and walk out? I don't have to do that slavery. So both the first and the final redemption involve the liberation of the Jewish people. And just as the Exodus encompassed the entire nation and resulted from the Jews' collective service, so will the future redemption liberate all Jews from exile, and it too will result from our collective efforts. Now, this collective liberation, meaning that we do as a people, And this effort came about during the Exodus as a result of the effort of each Jew, who first liberated himself from his own spiritual exile. In other words, in Egypt, people had to take a sheep and tie it down in their own apartment, wherever they lived. And that took courage. They had to say, I'm going forward. I'm going forward with God. I'm not going to be rational. What kind of thing is this? I'm just, God wants me to go forward. I'm going forward. And so with the final liberation, the efforts of each and every Jew in redeeming himself from spiritual exile will result in the collective redemption of all Jews from the final exile. So in other words, each of us has to do our part. In practical terms, each and every Jew is entrusted by God with a unique mission that he and only he is capable of accomplishing. And he can't rely on someone else to fulfill that mission for him. For the other individuals entrusted with his own mission. So that means that each of us has something that's ours to do personally. On the other hand, each person has to also realize that he's part of a collective, the Jewish nation. And his mission is essential not only to himself, but to all the Jewish people. So fulfilling his mission as an individual helps the Jewish people fulfill their mission as a collective whole. Ultimately, each Jew's personal redemption from spiritual exile leads to the collective redemption of all Jews from the final exile. We have to understand that every time we work to put soul into what we're doing, whatever it is, clearing our desk, saying a blessing before we eat, that when we are working on doing it in a genuine way as a free person with soul, this makes a difference in the whole world. In other words, it's not just that I'm doing this in this little room, so who knows about it? But that whatever we are doing has cosmic repercussions and it's felt in the whole world. So we need to know that the importance of our own blessing and doing what we know needs to be done by me here, even though there's not another person to see it necessarily, that this is part of my mission in the world. So we see in the Haggadah, we see it that there are levels of redemption. When God promised Moshe, and we always need to know it's not all or nothing, and we are in process. But when God promised Moshe that he would deliver the children of Israel out of Egypt, he did so by using 4 different expressions of deliverance. He said, God said, I will bring you out, meaning from the suffering of Egypt, and I will save you, meaning from enslavement, and I will deliver you, and I will take you for me as a nation, and I will be for you the Lord. Now, looking deeper, we see that the first 3 expressions, I will bring you out, I will save you, I will deliver you, primarily relate to taking the children of Israel out of physical subjugation. But the primary goal of the deliverance from Egypt was to bring them to spiritual freedom through receiving the Torah, as stated by God in his first revelation to Moshe at the burning bush. So before Moses was even told to go and free the people, God showed him a burning bush and said, when you will bring out this nation, you will worship God on this mountain, Mount Sinai. And this is referred to in the 4th expression, I will take you for me as a nation, and I will be for you the Lord. I just want to point out that what we see in this story, like here we're still in exile, although we are told that now is the time, we need to wait for Mashiach, Mashiach is coming. But look at Moshe, he was the one who came to save the Jewish people. The Jewish people didn't know that that was happening. When God was saying to Moshe at the burning bush, when you bring out this nation, well, the nation certainly didn't feel brought out at that moment. You will worship God on this mountain, Mount Sinai. They didn't know anything that was going to happen. They were just involved in their slavery. They didn't know that it was in process already. And we need to know that our redemption is in process. And we can see it and know it in many ways if we open our eyes. So all this is referring to the fourth expression. I will take you for me as a nation. I will be for you the Lord. What we learn in this verse is that our nationality of our people is tied together with connection to God. And it's not possible to separate the two. Now, the nation of Israel is unique in this. Other nations grew from families into tribes and then groups of tribes and developed into a nation. And the unifying forces of their nationhood were closeness that had to do with their families, a single language, a single territory. But this was not the case with the nation of Israel. Everything was given to Israel by divine command. God said to Abraham, the father of the nation, go out from your land and your birthplace to the land that will become Israel, which I will show you. This means that the formation of the country of Israel was by divine decree. And the force which unifies the nation is God's commands. It is strong when the nation of Israel is serving God. Therefore, it's impossible to separate the nation of Israel and the land of Israel from God and from the fulfilling of his divine command, the Torah. And this, the Zohar says, God, the Torah, and Israel are one. So what is the significance of the spiritual deliverance being phrased by the term, I will take you? To understand this, let's look at the words of our sages on the Jerusalem Talmud. How do we know to drink specifically 4 cups of wine at the Passover Seder meal? So this is something that we actually do physically at the Seder. We drink 4 cups of wine, and it has to do with the 4 statements that God made of taking us out into liberation. So the soul in its source, our souls, were attached to God, and it's called a part of godliness from above, until it became distanced from him and descended to become enclosed in a physical body in the world. So we have godly souls that are in God, and then we come down into this world, into our bodies, and we're not supposed to be distant from God. That's the work, to continue to be connected to God, even as we come down into the world and are in the world. So the nation of Israel is called a part. It says in Deuteronomy, for his nation is a part of God. Now, in the subjugation and exile in Egypt, the children of Israel became distanced from God. Now, we see this in the world, where people feel imprisoned or affected by what's going on. Instead of knowing that God is in charge, people think that other people are in charge or situations are in charge. And that made people come to a lower level, because we have to know who we are. When we're part of God, we know how we're connected and we remain connected. But going into slavery in Egypt, they descended to the lowest level and sank into the 49 levels of impurity. That means little by little by little, they were forgetting about God and about their godly soul. Doesn't mean they forgot, but it wasn't in actual reality of how they lived. And that's what it means to be enslaved. So for this reason, the fourth term of deliverance mentioned in this verse is taking. When God says, I will take you as a nation, that God takes back his lost object, the divine soul, which dwells within the children of Israel, and reattaches it to the source from which it came. So this also lets us understand the order of the 4 cups of wine on the night of the Passover Seder. God uses 4 expressions of redemption in describing our exodus from Egypt and our birth as a nation. I will take you out, I will save you, I will redeem you, I will take you as a nation. So our sages instituted that we should drink a cup of wine for each one of these expressions. So cup number 1, we recite the Kiddush over the first cup. That's at the very beginning. We didn't even begin to say anything yet. Very beginning, Kadesh, we say the Kiddush. The second cup of wine, we read the Exodus story from the Haggadah over the second cup. The third cup, we recite the grace after meals over the third cup. And the fourth cup is we say the large Hallel, which are praises and hymns of God, over the fourth cup. Now, during the Seder, we can experience these elements of redemption in a spiritual sense. So as we're going through the Seder, we should be recognizing that these 4 aspects, I will take you out, Kiddush, I will save you, telling the story of the Haggadah, how people were enslaved and God took us out. I will redeem you, that we have in mind the grace after meals. And I will take you as a nation, and I'll be your God, is when we say the big Hallel where we praise God. Now, during the Seder, we can experience these elements of redemption in a spiritual sense as well. And there are a number of explanations about the significance of the various stages of redemption that come out in each one. So one way to look at it is that the first is salvation from harsh labor. And this began as soon as the plagues were introduced. The second one is salvation from servitude. The day that the Jews left Egypt geographically and arrived at Ramses, they had been saved. But then the third one is the splitting of the Red Sea, after which the Jews felt completely redeemed without the fear of the Egyptians recapturing them. And the fourth was becoming a nation at Sinai. So we see that even though the Jews became free after they were taken out of Egypt, when they came to the Red Sea and they saw the Egyptian army pursuing them, they were afraid again because they had not integrated their freedom. During the Seder, we can experience these elements of redemption in a spiritual sense by leaving our Egypt and our servitude to our egos. This also has to do with eating matzah. And this is actually, there is actually a fifth expression in this verse. It says, and I will bring you to the land which I promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I will give it to you as an inheritance. That's the fifth expression. So while the exodus from Egypt and the birth of the Jewish nation were permanent, we have yet to be brought to Israel on a permanent basis. That's the fifth cup. So in honor of this verse, we have a fifth cup at the Seder, the cup of Elijah. It's the cup of Eliyahu and Navi. This cup is set up for Elijah during the second half of the Seder, but we do not drink it. Eliyahu will announce the arrival of Mashiach, who will bring all Jews to Israel for good. So we see that there are steps in the process of redemption, a gradual and cumulative process. We see that there is this fifth cup that we can't drink yet because there's more to come, but we are in process. We need to know this is a gradual and ongoing cumulative process. So the revelation of God's infinite light within this physical world is a product of our acts of worship throughout the period of exile. And everything that we do is adding to redemption, to the redemption process. If we were aware, we would already see that godly light, which has been drawn down here by all the mitzvah acts performed throughout the generations. We will see what is already present. In other words, this has been going on for generations, and this godly light is being drawn down by every mitzvah of all the generations. But how can we see this? How can we come to this perspective? So opening our eyes to what is new to be seen means getting beyond the habitual way that we look at our lives. Being habitual is being enslaved. And nothing is automatic, even though people think, well, that's just how it goes. Feels like it's automatic. Nothing is automatic. Although someone with a slave mentality may feel that they can't make changes, that the outside controls them. In other words, there are times that we begin things and we need to continue. We need to move forward and not say, well, that's too hard for me. I don't know. What was I thinking when I decided to do that? Sometimes, you're knitting a little blanket and it turns out that you just kind of put it aside because you were busy and it seemed like, I don't know. And then you take it out and you realize, wait a minute, this is just a little bit left. You're crocheting it, you're knitting it, and whoa, why did I put it down? I was so close to having finished it. And then you take it out and you actually finish it. So we shouldn't give up on ourselves and on our projects and on what we're doing. I'm speaking to myself. This is all of us. This is what it means heading for true freedom. So nothing is automatic, but a person with a slave mentality could feel that they can't make the changes because they feel controlled by the outside. But we are free. We are free. And we continue to believe that we choose our focus. And with enough determined effort, we can and we will break free. This is our godly work. So the Jewish calendar is giving us 8 days each year to celebrate that faith. Emunah. The 8 days of Pesach, of Passover, our season of freedom, embody the conviction that in any given moment, we have the power to step out of slavery. In the words of the Haggadah, from slavery to freedom, from sorrow to joy, from mourning to festivity, from darkness to great light, from bondage to redemption, that at any moment we can step out. Our sages decreed that the exodus from Egypt is an event that should recur in every generation of our history and in every day of our lives. For what else is an exodus if not the power of a people to step out of their past, to pull free of their circumstances, to give birth to a new self that is independent of the place from which it has come. So it's time to stop feeling stuck. The deeper meaning of the name Passover as a word in Hebrew, Pesach means to jump over. So walking or running refers to a change of place, but this change comes from and is controlled by the place you were just in. One foot leaves the ground, but the other remains there to push us forward. And the movement could be small or big, slow or fast, but in all cases, in walking, every step derives from the one before it. So you're coming from where you're coming from. But that's not how we become free. Remember, Pesach means a leap. So a jump in which both feet leave the ground implies a break from the past. a quantum leap. That's not just physical. A quantum leap is on every level, rather than an incremental step. It's a rebirth, not just a maturing. You know, when we have a birthday, and in a certain way, every day is a birthday, it's a new moment to be born, to be reborn, not just, okay, I hope today will be a little better than yesterday, because that's coming from what yesterday was. But this is a new moment. This is a new beginning. I have the choice over how much I'm going to pick up my phone or waste time or whatever people's not such good habits are. It's in my choice. And I can jump beyond it. I can choose, make choices that are freedom choices instead of stuck slavery choices. But the purpose of the jump is also not to just jump up to heaven and stay there. The idea is to return to the ground, not just having moved ahead, but also as a different person from the one who crouched down to get ready to jump. This jump is not to return to our past as a prisoner bound by its laws. We're not supposed to jump and come back to the same place, but we're supposed to, how do we come back from this jump? As a master coming down on it from above to use it and mold it to its higher ends as he advances on his journey until the next jump. In other words, a leap. Let me use the example of the phone because that's a very common example. Can't be just me. That we have a choice, that we could say from this time to that time, I'm not going to make any calls, or I'm not going to open the phone, or I'm just going to see if there's a call I need to take, but I'm not going, no WhatsApp. From this time to that time, stop. I get to choose. And that is a leap. And if I make that leap, then I come down as a free person. Now I have time that I'm going to use for things that are important to me instead of feeling enslaved. And then we jump, we come down from above, looking at things from a higher level. And then we advance in our journey until the next jump. So when Rabbi Nachman says we have to start new every day and sometimes many times a day, that means that we have a choice, that we really have a choice. I told this to my grandson, who's 20 years old, and he told me that has made a big change in his life. Because at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, he doesn't feel, well, this day is over. He can start new at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and decide what to do at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Start again. Have a happy day. Have a meaningful day. A new leap, a new jump can take place at 4 o'clock in the afternoon at any time. So we see that the freedom of Passover is a dynamic freedom. It's not just the absence of bondage. Freedom is not just the removal of all external constraints on a person's development and self-expression. Passover is a more ambitious freedom. We see that the redemption is part of an ongoing process. So I want to mention that the Exodus from Egypt, which marked the end of Israel's subjugation to their Egyptian enslavers, was just the first step of a 7-week journey, a 49-step climb in the transcendence of self that culminated in our receiving the Torah at Mount Sinai on the festival of Shavuot. So I want to mention the mitzvah that begins on the day after this, on the night after the first Seder, and that is counting the Omer. And then we're going to count 7 weeks and 50 days I know 7 times 7 is 49. But we're going to count to 7 weeks, and each day we work on ourselves. Each day so if you would like to know more about it, you can look it up on Chabad.org and look up Sfirat HaOmer. It's a wonderful, wonderful mitzvah, because each day we work on developing our inner freedom, bringing ourselves to integrate the faith with which we followed God out of the slavery of Egypt. So the matzah that we eat on the first day, the bread of faith, we take it into ourselves. And till we get to Shavuot, each day we are integrating faith in its unique way. Day 1 is Chesed Shebechesed. Day 2 is Gevurah Shebechesed. Day 3 is Tiferet Shebechesed. So it's a new day. And whether we are aware of the meaning of each day, or whether just each day we say, I'm working on my inner freedom, because we're bringing ourselves to integrate that faith that came on the first day when we followed God out of slavery. And on the 50th day, Shavuot represents the final realization of freedom at Sinai, when we were given the potential and challenge to get to a deeper dimension of freedom and self-transcendence. Because in terms of time, Shavuot is the only festival that has no calendar date. It takes place on the day that follows a 7-week count from the festival of Pesach. And this is to emphasize that Shavuot is an outgrowth of Passover, that the significance of the Exodus became clear only on the day that we stood at Sinai. So as God is telling Moshe at the beginning of his mission to liberate the Jewish people, this is your sign that I have sent you. When you take this nation out of Egypt, you will serve God on this mountain. So God was saying the purpose of going out of Egypt is to come to Sinai. And then the purpose is to live in Israel. We have we will have a Beit HaMikdash. But this is a process of true freedom. So when Moshe was standing in front of the Pharaoh, he didn't just say, let my people go. He said, let my people go that they may serve me, serve God. So we're not free just to do whatever we feel like doing. We're free in order to be in the world to serve God. So what is this liberating service? It means that every person, no matter how free he feels he is or not, is a finite being subject to the limits of his own nature and character. We all have personalities, and we all feel affected by those natures and personalities. To get true freedom, each one of us has to transcend our humanity, to transcend the emotional, intellectual, and even spiritual self, and access the spark of godliness that is his infinite suprahuman self. So when we say, I'm a human, what do you want? That's slavery. We have to get beyond to the infinite superhuman, beyond human self, to the godly soul that each of us has. And ultimately, we're all connected in that same source. The Torah, God's blueprint for life on earth, outlines the observances and the practices that enable us to realize our divine essence in our daily lives. So God's Torah is telling us how. It's a path to success. The day we left the borders of Egypt, we were free in the conventional sense. It wasn't anymore that some outside taskmaster was going to tell people what they could or could not do. And during the days of the counting of the Omer, the 49 days of becoming ready to meet God at Sinai, we also worked on freeing ourselves of the alien influences that affected us from within the pagan habits and mindset that centuries of subjection to the depraved culture of Egypt had imposed on us, and our own inborn negative inclinations. So we see that what's going on around us seems very often like the norm, but it's not God's norm. So we're supposed to know the difference and not take in the bad habits that are around us. And also our own negative inclinations are habits that we picked up, like what God said to Avram, leave your, all those habits that he got from the society, that we also have to leave, get beyond our own negative inclinations. Then at Sinai, we were empowered to strive for a deeper dimension of freedom, a freedom that's not just the negation of forces and influences, but getting over our own positive psychological and behavioral patterns, even the behavior patterns that are positive, sometimes hold people back from freedom. So there's nothing from godly freedom. So there's nothing negative about our human potential. It's good to have human potential, but we're capable of more, of raising our achievements to a level in relation to which yesterday's liberated self is limited and subjective. So whatever situation we're in and whatever we do, and even if it was great, when we're starting today, I remember we can start many times a day, that we have a new liberated self to go to a new level of freedom. So when the sages said a person works on seeing himself as if he has himself come out of Egypt, we are working on freeing ourselves from yesterday's boundaries. And this is an ongoing effort. For freedom is more than the drive to escape from what's holding what is against our purpose, or whatever Egypt is trying to hold us back. No matter how free we are from them, we still feel defined by the boundaries of self and self-definition. Well, that's who I am. And that is a kind of slavery. So freedom is the continual drive to pass over these boundaries, to draw on our divine infinite potential, to constantly get beyond what we are. And this is our service of becoming free. Our personal efforts to become free affects the world. Instead of thinking of ourselves as attached to our past trauma, we're not tied down. Very often people think of themselves as stuck by what happened in the past. I remember once somebody wanted me to go to an Al-Anon meeting to see what it was. It's a 12-step meeting. And I went with that person, and a woman was speaking about the trauma in her life coming from what it was like to live with her ex-husband. And she spoke about that, and she was very impassioned about it. And so my friend wanted me to understand what the meeting was. Okay, so I saw the meeting and I understood it. But as I was getting up to leave, I had this feeling to ask this woman who had spoken how long she had been divorced. And she told me she had been divorced for 26 years. In other words, she was still enslaved by that marriage. She wasn't free. She felt so traumatized by what had been in the past that she wasn't a free person. For 26 years, she could start a new life, but she was still involved in that. And that's not a freedom. And we have to get beyond defining ourselves by where we were and what happened and how it was. And we have to stop feeling stuck by those things. So freedom is the continual drive to pass over these boundaries, to draw on our divine infinite potential to constantly get beyond where we are. Okay, so whatever happened was divine providence. And even if we made a mistake, that was also divine providence. We don't have to sit there looking at the past and saying, how terrible. We need to say, this is where I am right now. Where does God want me to go? How can I go forward? And this is our service of becoming free. Our personal efforts to become free affects the world. So instead of thinking of ourselves as attached to this past trauma, we're not tied down. We are free to move forward. In Hebrew, exile is called gola, but this word hints at the path to redemption. So when we insert the letter aleph, the word gola, exile, becomes geula, redemption. So all that's missing is that aleph. And the Talmud states, what does aleph indicate? Alufo shel olam, the ruler of the world. Aleph is the first letter of the alphabet, Aleph, Bet, Gimel. And Aleph is the first letter and the first number. It is the start of everything. Even the Chumash begins with Bereshit, with a Beit. And God is before that. God is the essence. So God preceded all existence, and he's the source of all time and space. And when we draw the Aleph, God, into every aspect of life, we live in a state of redemption because our mundane life is infused with godliness. That means that in a certain moment, when we have a choice, we can say, I'm living in God's presence. What does God want me to do? What can I do in this moment? How can I live as a free person in this moment? And in this way, we liberate ourselves and we influence the people around us because we're living with God right here in our world. The Aleph, when the Aleph is here, we are living in Geula. We are living in redemption. So when many personal redemptions are achieved, then redemption is brought to the entire world. So this is our work right now, to individually and together do what we can to live with a Geula mentality, to know that just like when the Jews were still slaves, God was talking to Moshe at the burning bush and say, well, when you take them out, as if there was a foregone conclusion, when you take them out, then you're going to go to Mount Sinai. All of this was in process. And we're talking about the faith of Pesach, the emunah, the egolessness of eating the matzah. We need to know that God has this all together, that we are in process, moving forward. And that what does it mean that the matzah is flat? That it's not ego, that we don't say, but I don't know, how are you going to do it? Is it really happening? All these things. No, but that we're in God's presence and we take that faith and we bring that godly faith with us and we get up and go forward. We leap forward. And then we come back with the action that we choose to take that is godly action. So may we experience the Geula Shlema, the complete Geula, where it is obvious to everyone that all there is God, and that we are here for a purpose. So as we're heading toward our Pesach preparation, may it go easily and clearly and beautifully. And may we know that we're doing whatever we're doing in the service of God. And may our true redemption be revealed. Be blessed.